Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, June 4th, 2025, and our friends Ray McGovern and John Helmer are back with us. Welcome back.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
John, let's get started with what Maria Zakharova said about the drone attack. And she says that the Kiev regime, with backing from EU and Western sponsors, carried out a terrorist attack. And it was a drone attack on nuclear bombers in Russia.
Yes.
We know that they had to keep them in the open because of the treaties between the United States and Russia, and the attacks on two bridges in Bryansk and Kursk region. Your take on that, John?
Well, let's start with this because it's just in the last couple of hours taken place. Yes, there was a briefing by Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesman, and there was also a set of briefings and meetings at the Kremlin, or a virtual meeting in which President Putin also met with government ministers and had a discussion. And this changes the way in which we understand the Russian side will respond to, on the one hand, the attacks on the railway, or the bridges and the railway lines in Bryansk and Kursk, and second, the attacks on the 5 air bases. The important thing is, in a sense, what was not said. So let's begin with the Putin meeting, which does not refer explicitly to the airbase attacks. Instead, and I'm looking at the papers in order to read them, what we see is President Putin chairing a meeting of government ministers, receiving reports from Vladimir Medinsky on the negotiations in Istanbul, and a report from Mr. Bastrikin, the head of the investigative committee, on the so-called terrorism actions that destroyed the railway bridges and caused the disruption of the railway line. What we see there, and I'll sum it up, but if you want, I can quote, is that Putin is, the president is calling the railway and bridge attack an act of terrorism. It's very important to understand that the Russian government is describing both the railway bridge attack and the airfield attack, which we would consider an act of war and a war crime, to be an act of terrorism. And this is a very important distinction, because it leads to the decision of the Russian government not to have massive strategic retaliation against the Ukrainian government for the attack on the air bases. Now, would our audience, would you, Ray, regard these attacks as acts of war or acts of terrorism? The Russian side has decided to minimize its retaliation and the level at which it retaliates by calling these acts not acts of war, but acts of terrorism. Sergei Lavrov has just said in the last couple of hours at the meeting with President Putin, I'll just read it: despite all this, Vladimir Vladimirovich, and despite the new major criminal provocations in the last few days, I would consider it important not to succumb to these provocative actions clearly aimed at disrupting negotiations and continuing to receive weapons from European countries. That's the signal that what I've been calling the ORESHNIK moment, the decision to make a significant higher level of response on the Russian side against the Ukrainian state, will not happen. It's being subordinated to the negotiating process. And that's an offer to President Trump. Second, I can just try to read you what President Putin's saying. Essentially, he's saying, but what was in Bryansk? In Bryansk areas, and I'm quoting, I'm reading from what he just said, are a targeted strike against civilians. And for all international standards, such actions are called terrorism. In other words, the act of hitting civilians is defined as a terrorist act, not an act of war and a war crime on the part of the Ukrainian state, although Russian officials are leaving no doubt. They blame the Ukrainian state. These are government actions. And because they're hitting civilians, they're described as terrorist actions. Now, this is a peculiarity in Russian law, and I'll come to that later on if we need to. But Putin is also leaving out mention of the airfield attacks. Zakharova left out the airfield attacks in her briefing a couple of hours ago, but was asked explicitly to comment on the airfield attacks. Her answer, let me see what I've got here. Her answer, the question was, does Russia believe the West was involved in attacks on Russian air bases and infrastructure that occurred over the weekend? If so, what countries are we talking about? What will Russia's response be? This is our question. What will Russia's response be? Now, let me read you what Maria Zakharova has just said. Quotes, the West is involved in the terrorist activities of the Kiev regime. The first one, the countries of the collective West supply weapons precisely to carry out terrorist attacks. They do not impose any conditions or restrictions. On the questions about how appropriate it is to supply weapons and to the extent, from a legal point of view, to adequately supply weapons that are used for terrorist activities, they have long ceased to respond. Second, Zakharova continuing, they act as gunners, provide coordinates. Only Western countries and only Western companies have such opportunities. Third, no terrorist attack, which was qualified with all the facts, has ever received any condemnation in the West. No one in the Western countries at the official level even tried to shake the Kiev regime. In other words, Zakharova for the foreign ministry, Lavrov, the foreign minister at the meeting with the president, and all other officials, including President Putin, are describing the attacks on both the railway line and bridge in Kursk and Bryansk and the 5 airbase attacks as terrorism. This is important because under the Russian nuclear doctrine of last December, Section 19C, and I'm again looking at my papers so as to not make a mistake about this, an attack by a non-nuclear state on Russia's nuclear triad, its capability to deter nuclear attack on Russia, is considered a violation of the nuclear deterrence regime and requires under Russian policy a significant strategic level of attack. So what we have here is a very important legal distinction, not being spelled out by the Russian side in the last few minutes, but we can do it. The Russian side is making a distinction between acts of terrorism by the Ukrainian state. There's no doubt that Bastrykin for the prosecution system in Russia has said these were Ukrainian supplied materials, Ukrainian directed attacks. Zakharova for the foreign ministry is saying the Ukrainian government directed these attacks, including the airfield attacks. The Ukrainian government has claimed credit. The SBU has claimed express credit for the attacks on the airfield. And yet the Russian state is saying these are acts of terrorism by a terrorist regime, not an act of war by a state subject to the Russian nuclear doctrine. This means that Russia will not use the ORESHNIK moment to attack at a strategic level. Instead, it's saying we will subordinate our retaliatory capacity, subordinate it to the negotiations. And I've just, during the day, spoken with my sources in Moscow, and what they say is the same. I asked expressly on the issue of will there be an ORESHNIK retaliation. My source in a position to know said, the launch of the ORESHNIK is unlikely now. I'm reading it. Perhaps later, quotes, only if there is certainty that Trump will not deliver. Maybe now a measured strike to help Trump focus.
Wow.
Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I've learned now by this last hour not to be talking to any other interviewer and miss all the news. Thank you very much, John. This really did happen within the last hour.
Yes.
And John, you're absolutely right that the distinction that the Russians are making is a sigh of relief on my part. But I have to sort of recall that I never thought that it was an ORESHNIK moment. I mean, let's face it, the situation is different now. The Russians and the Americans are talking at the very highest level. Lavrov has Rubio's telephone number. I don't know whether Blinken ever gave him his telephone number, but he has Rubio that he called him right away. Okay, this is significant. They're talking. So Lavrov calls the Secretary of State Rubio, and he says, "Look, these damn bridges, were blown." And Rubio says, "Yeah, we're aware of those bridges." And how did they put it in the readout here? Rubio conveyed sincere condolences for the civilian casualties from the rail infrastructure blasts in Bryansk and the Kursk regions. So what does that tell me? It tells me right off the bat, okay, that Lavrov didn't come with guns blazing and said, "What are you doing here? Or are you Rubio and your president?" No. What he did was mention the bridges blown, and although the readout doesn't include this, I'm sure since those long, deep penetration attacks into long-range air bases, they happened just a couple hours before, that he said to Rubio, "Hey, and besides which, what is this all about? Did you know about this?" Now, in my view, Rubio could very convincingly say, "I didn't know the first word about this." How about your president? Did he know about it? Well, I can't conceive that he did, but I'll ask him. In other words, look, they're tamping down this thing right at the start, okay? Rubio is not being accused of being involved. It's somebody else being involved. It's the British, in my view, who love to blow up things. Bridges is one of their favorites. So, in other words, what we have here is a kind of a tamping down in consonance with what I've been saying all along. Priority is being given to U.S.-Russian relations, and everything else is subordinate to that, including Ukraine. Now, just to finish this up, the reason I'm a little groggy this morning is partly because I already did an hour and a half interview, but also because my my editor at Consortium News called me last evening and said, "Look, do you believe in the ORESHNIK moment?" And I said, "No, I see lots of reasons not to believe in it." He says, "Well, could you write something?" So 1 o'clock this morning, I gave him a piece. It's you may have seen it. It's in Consortium News this morning. I just read you the first paragraph. Ukraine's drone strikes on air bases deep inside Russia on Sunday were timed to provoke Russia into shunning the Russia-Ukraine talks set for the next day in Istanbul. Zelensky and his European puppeteers also may have thought that they could provoke Putin to escalate attacks on Ukraine to such a degree that the US could not possibly walk away from Ukraine without appearing cowardly. Now, I think those are the two reasons for the timing. The other thing is, it must be added that these were very artful, very well planned operations, okay? Blowing up stuff like that deep in Russia. Now, there weren't 40 planes. We have the readout from some of the photography now. It's at most 9 or 10 planes, probably 5, okay? At 2 bases, not at 5. So what's the result here? The result is the same sort of thing that the British achieved when they were really good at sabotage behind German lines in France and elsewhere. They blew up things very artfully. It didn't make a damn difference about the outcome of the war. And this is not going to make a damn bit of difference with respect to the outcome of the war, even though it must be conceded that the Russian security services have taken a black eye and forgot this really terrible stuff that happened. They'll be chided, and some of them they won't be shot, as would have been the case under Stalin. And some of the Russian people are calling for that. No, they'll be penalized, they'll be identified, and maybe even not publicized. They'll be removed from their posts. What else? Well, I guess the other thing is that what happened was that it didn't work, okay? In other words, Putin and Trump, perhaps with Rubio and Lavrov taking the action, they said, look, we'll go ahead with the talks tomorrow in Istanbul. And actually, what happened? Well, people said, it was just an hour and nothing happened. Well, people are prejudging Istanbul. What happened was that the two sides exchanged their term papers, as John refers to them. This is big. The Ukrainians said, we'll read your term paper and get back to you in 10 days, 2 weeks. That also is significant. And, from a humanitarian point of view, 6,000 frozen Ukrainian corpses given back for decent burial. I mean, that's a step in the right direction. Young people who were dragged off the nightclubs and the streets being freed. These are baby steps, okay? They don't address the seemingly irreconcilable differences, but, there was progress there. It's not quite correct to demean it and say there was no progress. So, bottom line, they tried to wrong foot Putin by inviting him to cancel the talks in Istanbul and ORESHNIK the hell out of Ukraine, which he resisted doing, okay? That's good news because they're talking, the US and Russia, and that's the backdrop to all of this. The Russians and the Americans, for whatever reason, it's kind of a little puzzling even to me. They're putting the priority on developing the kind of decent relationship between the two that Trump was preventing from doing back during his first term.
Can I respond, Nima?
John,
Yeah.
just to confirm what Ray just said, he said what Putin said in this meeting, he said that terrorist attacks in the Kursk and Bryansk regions were aimed at disrupting the negotiations in Istanbul. And
Correct.
he says the illegitimate Kiev regime is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization, which is when and its sponsors its sponsors are becoming more involved in these terrorist attacks. Go ahead, John.
Well, let
Well,
me just add here that I didn't give Putin an advance copy of my draft last night, okay? And so don't put Putin in my pocket, okay? And I'm not in Putin's pocket. But I was gratified to hear this latest news that he is pretty much confirming what I speculated, just 8 hours ago or so.
I think it's very important to understand what the public Russian position is, as just articulated, and what the real Russian understanding is, and what public opinion understands too. In the first place, the Russian view is that the Americans cannot be trusted, that they're playing a double game at all times. That's the underlying, privately stated position. My sources, the military sources, it's being repeated over and over. And one should always understand when reading the public statement, the private view is nothing the United States officials say, not now, not before, not in future, can be trusted. So second, these attacks are understood on the Russian side, and also the Crimean Bridge was attacked during the day. The American administration, the Trump administration, is understood to be playing a double game, a double game. The question operationally from the Russian point of view is not to invoke the nuclear warfare red line. There's no doubt that section 19C of the nuclear warfare doctrine says actions by an adversary affecting elements of critically important state or military infrastructure of the Russian Federation, the disablement of which would disrupt the response action by nuclear forces, is an act of war that's nuclear at the nuclear level. However, the Russian side has decided to call this a terrorist action aimed at disrupting the negotiation. Now, what happened in the Lavrov-Rubio conversation was, as Ray said, Lavrov called Rubio, initiated the call several hours. The attack on the air bases occurred about 1:30 Moscow time, and Lavrov called Rubio about 8 p.m. Russia time. Rubio's readout of that meeting was the shortest one-line readout I have ever seen in the history of State Department readouts of communications with a nuclear power like Russia. It was Lavrov's readout that added that Rubio issued his condolences for the bridge attack, not for the other one. That was not in Rubio's statement. Rubio has said nothing whatever about the strategic nuclear warfare attack, and neither has the president. If you look at the official log of President Trump's meetings and activities, he played, the log says on Sunday, he played a golf game. On Monday, he had an intelligence briefing and a lunch with Vance. He has said nothing. However, the White House spokesman was authorized to say, and let me flip over here and see if I can find what she said. The White House press spokesman was asked, what's the president's reaction to that Ukrainian drone attack, stunning drone attack on Russian air bases? I'm sure he saw that. What's his reaction? That was the press asking the White House to respond to the attack on the air bases. Answer, entirely evasive, a zero. Quotes, well, look, the reaction is this war needs to come to an end. And this war has been brutal from both sides. Too many people have died, and the president wants this war to end at the negotiating table. And he's made that very clear to both leaders, both publicly and privately. There was silence from the Pentagon. There's been a Pentagon briefing. Secretary Hegseth has said nothing whatever about the attack on a military target of nuclear deterrence, one of the triads. So there was silence there. Trump's spokesman focused on the negotiations, which has been the Russian line. Now, let me come to the other significant, but the only explicit response from the US side, and that came from retired General Keith Kellogg. Kellogg, and I think you've got the clip there, Nima, addressed explicitly the attack on the bases. And he did it. Let's just go. Let me
play it for you, John. Before.
Okay, that's a good idea. Let's have everybody listen to. This is the only explicit response by the US side. And this confirms on the Russian side that the Russians privately think the US is playing a double game. But go ahead.
And thanks for having me today, both of you. Yeah, I think it has. I think Caroline said it very clearly. Look, when you look what's happened in the last 123 days, I've made this comment earlier that it's more progress than the last 123 days than 1,230 days in the previous administration, because we've had 5 major meetings. We had Riyadh, we had Jeddah, we had Paris, we had London, we had Istanbul, now we have Istanbul too as well. And the fact that both sides are actually facing each other, looking at each other, that hadn't happened before. It has happened now because President Trump kind of drove us to a position where they're actually talking. And as long as you're talking, it's going to reduce the level of violence going into the future. At least you hope it is. And we're going to come up with a solution. Look, I'll be really honest with you. It's really hard. I mean, this is a very difficult situation that the president found himself in. And again, he inherited this war. He didn't start this war. He's trying to end this war. And he's trying to do it in a reasonable fashion. And I think what happened is we had a very reasonable position come in with Ukrainians. The Russians came in with a very maximalist position. And, now what you try to do is you try to bridge that. You try to say, okay, where are the areas that we can actually work? And we can actually kind of find where this will work out. And I think that's what we're trying to do right now, even in Istanbul, when you had the Ukrainian chief negotiator, Umerov, there. Medinsky is the chief Russian negotiator there, sitting together, looking at each other and saying, okay, how can we get together? And the Turks have been very, very good. Their foreign minister, Fidan, was there. He's kind of the mediator, the one who's actually physically on the ground. And President Erdogan of Turkey has been very, very supportive of the meetings. It's the reason why the second time we went into Istanbul to do this. So, Jackie, I'm kind of a born optimist that I hope hopefully we can get to a position, because the deaths are horrendous, the violence is horrendous, and you want to kind of cut back on that. And I'm telling you, the risk levels are going way up. I mean, what happened this weekend, people have to understand in the national security space, when you attack an opponent's part of their national survival system, which is their triad, the nuclear triad, that means your risk level goes up because you don't know what the other side's going to do. You're not sure. And that's what they actually did. And the one that really concerned me was the fact that there have been reports that they attacked the northern fleet headquarters in Severomorsk. And if that's the case, if when you attack 2 legs of a triad, that first of all was a very bold attack. And when you do that, it's very clear the risk levels will go up. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to get to a position where the risk levels are going so high that this thing will expand. And that's where we don't want to be.
So you're referring.
This is very important. There are 2 elements here. First of all, the president didn't say anything, and his spokesman was evasive. The National Security Advisor / Secretary of State didn't say anything. The Secretary of Defense, nothing. But Kellogg was authorized to say these things, and he said it in 2 different ways, which are read as a U.S. double game and a focus on the negotiations. In the first place, he correctly says this was a nuclear warfare act. confirming what the Russians don't want to say, but he said it. And he said, Kellogg said, but we don't want it. The risk level goes up, but it was a bold attack. Plus for the Ukrainians, but maybe a kind of minus on the US side. And that's not where we want to be. But there's a very odd thing he also said. He referred to something he knew didn't happen. By referring to the Severomorsk attack, he knew, or ought to have known, that that didn't happen. Yes, in the first hours after the attack on the Olenya Air Base, nearby, a few 90 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, nearby, the video footage made it appear as if there'd been an attack in Severomorsk. And that was what the initial attempts, which the Ukrainians put out and encouraged people to believe, was that the second, the nuclear submarine leg of the triad had been attacked. Within hours, not only was that denied on the Russian side, but denied on the US side. So if you look at any of the maritime media, G Captain, for example, which comes from California and is very closely connected to and has good sources in the United States Navy, there was no doubt there had been no attack on Severomorsk, even though in the past there have been attacks, Ukrainian drone attacks attempting to penetrate in that area. Now, why did General Kellogg say something that wasn't true? Answer, it's hard to say from his way of speaking how ambiguous he wanted to be or how clear he wanted to be in conveying the message. The US is not comfortable with an attack by a bold ally of ours, no criticism of having done it, on the nuclear triad of Russia, because the US does not want to trigger an ORESHNIK moment on Putin's part to defend the nuclear triad as Russian nuclear deterrence policy required since December last year. So this is also confirmed by my military sources who read the memorandum, as they call it, or Section 1, as they call it. Section 1 of the memorandum, that's the Russian term sheet as presented, and the details we can discuss. It's on the website that I've put out a day or two ago. My sources say, the Russian military says, look at Section 1 and Section 2 and Section 3. What they require is the US and all the Europeans will stop supplying weapons and intelligence to the Ukrainian state. It will be demilitarized across the territory. Now that's the test. And the Russian side are saying to give Trump room. The Europeans encouraged this attack. No one believes that this was entirely a European operation on the Russian side. That's being said as it's being described as a terrorist action in order to give Trump room to come to the terms President Putin has put on the table. And that means US, British, German, French, and NATO powers withdraw from the Ukraine. That's in the Russian term sheet. So the test is on Trump to respond. The test now is on Putin to respond. Putin is not going to retaliate until the Russian side sees that the US is not silent, which is tacit acceptance of a strategic attack, but active measures to stop it in the future. And that's the important thing. The test is on Putin. ORESHNIK moment. Putin says, no, the ORESHNIK moment depends on the Trump moment. No more silence. We've put our proposal on the table. Agree or we act in respect of the attack on the nuclear triad, as General Kellogg just mentioned.
Yeah, I guess this is really good, John, because we can disagree as reasonable people. I hope. Let 100 flowers bloom, as the Chinese used to
Well,
say.
let's say two flowers, your flower and my flower, bloom together. And,
well, with Nima, it'd be three.
Nima's the diligent gardener that makes us both flower. Thanks,
Yeah.
Nima.
One of the reasons that my editor asked me to write last night was because he didn't believe in the ORESHNIK moment, and neither he found out, as I told him, neither did I. And this whole business about the nuclear dimension of this thing is, in my view, overblown by well-meaning analysts that looked at the Russian doctrine on this and saw, whoa, wait a second, the Russians could interpret this as a blow at one of their triads and so forth. The initial reaction was, the significant was Lavrov calling Rubio and saying, look, we want to go ahead with Istanbul. We want to find out what you knew. Now, in terms of what the president knew, John, I thought I saw something indicating that the President Trump's spokeswoman, or maybe it was Rubio's spokeswoman, said that the president didn't know anything about this. Is that not true?
No, that was a statement made in relation to the attack on Putin's helicopter. That was.
Oh, I thought it was okay. Well, maybe I went out of touch. But let me get to the fundamentals here. Double dealing, divided administration. Yeah, I mean everyone sees that, especially Putin. But double dealing. Well, you're dealing with Trump. You're dealing with Witkoff, you're dealing with J.D. Vance, and now Rubio, and they're single dealing. And Putin is giving them the best, the benefit of the doubt. How about this fellow Kellogg? He's a general. He's a general, John, like many of the generals with whom you have contact in Moscow. Generals look at things in terms of specific threats and what they can do about it in a military sense. And generals lie. Sometimes they lie through their teeth. Sometimes they think it's okay to lie because the Ukrainians said it was so. And here's Kellogg. Syeveromorsk is really important. Was that attack too? Well, the Ukrainians said it was, and so I'll mention that. That's where you have a divided approach. But Putin and Lavrov know that quite well. Now, what else? I just say that to the degree that Kellogg depends on his information from what the Ukrainians tell him. It reminds me about July of 2023, when our then CIA head, Bill Burns, told the Washington Post, Putin has already lost in Ukraine. His military has been shown to be completely ineffectual. And then he told Biden to say the same thing, which he did a week later in Helsinki. Putin has already lost this thing. Now, I tried to figure out where in the hell Bill Burns got that. And I found out, guess where he was the week before he said that? Kiev. Who told him that? Zelensky. We got it all taken care of, Mr. Burns. Don't worry about it. Tell the presidents everything's okay. My God, what amateurish this. And you have Kellogg doing the same thing. So all I'm saying is that there are crazy people. There are people who are so military oriented that they look at the threat and they don't look at the context. And each little piece of information, like an attack, a presumed attack on a Russian nuclear missile carrying submarine base. Whoa, that's big news. So I got it from the Ukrainians. I don't have to check it out, although I could. I'll just say it. Okay. So we have to get past the blunder. And again, just to finish up on the ORESHNIK moment, I think that was that was a conclusion born of very meticulous investigation into, it's a base that has one of the triad, okay? And what does Russian doctrine say? Oh my God, oh my God. Well, it's also a base that had people that had planes that do conventional attacks, and indeed conventional attacks on Ukraine. So, to the degree, well, all I'm saying is you could overblow these things, and it's no surprise to me that since this was sort of accidental that there happened to be a strategic base, sure they knew about it, but did the U.S. condone that? It's reassuring to me that the Russians are playing a very cautious game. Putin being calm, collected, and careful, and we should be thankful for that and look forward to more negotiations in Istanbul. Whether they achieve anything or not is immaterial, because as the Russians continue within the next month or two, one of the main aims of the special military operation will have been achieved, and that is the destruction of the Ukrainian army, and then it'll be harder to deal from a realistic point of view to have some recent statement settlement.
John, I want to add something that Putin said. I think it would be a key to continue this discussion, is that Putin's on Kiev's request for meeting. He said, "Who negotiates with terrorists anyway? And why should they be rewarded by suspending military actions? For the Kiev regime, power is more important than peace and people's lives anyway." And when you look at the Zelensky administration and the way that they're trying to negotiate, and they're trying to pretend to negotiate with Russians, do you really believe that Putin said in these talks, and in this sort of talks that he did with the government, he said they're not interested in peace. They don't want peace, because the peace means that they're going to lose their position in Ukraine. Your take, John?
That's right.
Well, I there's no doubt he said that, and there's no doubt that that's a correct appreciation of the illegitimacy of the Zelensky regime. And this isn't a new statement. The Russian position has been, and it's in memorandum tabled in Istanbul, there must be new elections follow within a number of days of any ceasefire being signed. So new elections, regime replacement is part of the, let's call it, negotiating package that the Russians have tabled. So when President Putin refers to Zelensky the terrorist, he's referring to the negotiating requirement. Will the United States and the European allies and NATO oblige Zelensky to agree, and will they confirm their role in stopping the supply? That's what it is intended to mean. So as we started, the Russian side has decided to play down the strategic nuclear elements of the attack, knowing full well, and I don't believe that Kellogg was speaking foolishly. He's a presidential appointment, so he gets presidential White House approval when he speaks, and the information he was conveying is the only time the US side has responded to the nuclear attack. He didn't refer to it as a terrorist operation. He referred to it in positive terms. The Russian response is, look, gentlemen, this is the crunch time. It's crunch time. We've put on the table our root causes solution to this problem. You, Mr. Trump, you, the Europeans, we consider you act together. That's the private line. The public line is, Trump, divide from yourself and lead as the US has done with this war from the Europeans. That's the public line. The underlying meaning's the same. Crunch time is in the memorandum. Either you stop running the Ukrainians as proxies, as terrorists, you stop supplying the weapons, you stop supplying the money, you stop supplying the intelligence. That's in the proposed agreement. The Ukraine must be demilitarized across the country, not a short, small buffer zone in Sumy region. All four regions of Novorossiya must be recognized internationally as part of the Russian Federation, including Crimea. That's in the agreement tabled by Vladimir Medinsky on Monday. So what the Russian side has decided to do is put the US side in the ball in the court, if you like, but say silence on what's happened isn't good enough. But the way to answer, the way to convey more meaning than the White House agreed, Kellogg would say, the place and the method for saying what you respond is the Istanbul negotiation. Do you accept our terms? Until now, the US has opposed these root causes solution measures, which the Russians have put on the table. Until now, the European side and the US side has emphasized ceasefire first, negotiations later. The Russian side has said, no way we're going to accept that. We will go on fighting. And today's military operations along the line show an increased casualty rate, which means the Russian advance westward continues to advance westward at a higher pace, higher cost to the Ukrainians. But the crucial thing at this moment is it's a ORESHNIK moment for both sides. But the conditionality is come to the table and agree on our memorandum terms, pull back, and we won't use the ORESHNIK. That's the ORESHNIK moment on the Russian side, and it's intended to break the silence on the US side. Now, I agree with Ray. The Russian side is solidary, collective consensus. That's the way President Putin is demonstrating each day now by having meetings with military commanders, meetings and discussions with civilian leadership and so on. On the US side, Ray's right, we agree, there's division, there's splitting, there's purges underway in the Pentagon, in the National Security Council, State Department, intelligence services, of a kind that generates a loss of internal control, a loss of command, vertical control from the president down, and from the intelligence and military diplomatic services up. So you can readily see either chaos or division. Okay, if that's the story, and they sent out their minor batter, General Kellogg, to field the big ball of this game, the strategic nuclear one, that indicates weakness on the US side to come to any consensus. At the same time, Trump sent Lindsey Graham over to Kiev to negotiate with Zelensky. And we all know that Lindsey Graham is the most gung-ho anti-Russia voice in Washington. And what Trump has agreed to say is that he will look at the Graham sanctions bill on Russia and will respond, well, that's a partial lie. He knows perfectly well what Graham's sanctions bill says. He wants to, as it were, say, my big gun is Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill against Russia, and we will crush Russia, and we will crush its oil and gas and coal and energy exports by hitting sanctioning anyone, including the Chinese and the Indians of it. These are signs not of confusion, but of, let's say, partial coordination, competition between, let's say, advocates of different policies, competition and conflict and contest between the bureaucracies that make up Trump's administration. But the Russian side is saying, get your act together. It's an ORESHNIK moment for you too. You too. You want to pull out your Lindsey Graham moment? You're the ones who attacked us on the nuclear triad. Now you address what we've offered as a settlement on the battlefield so it does not go up the escalation ladder. And that's the really important thing, I'm glad to say, General Kellogg understands and shows. The escalation ladder has nuclear warfare and World War III on the top. The Ukrainian attack attempted to show that the Ukrainian side in this war, backed by the United States and the Europeans, has escalation dominance, escalation superiority that requires the Russian side to say, no, we have escalation dominance here and we will exercise it. That's the underlying strategic meaning of the ORESHNIK moment. And Kellogg's acknowledging that that's where we are. And Putin has, in not talking about it that way, acknowledged the same thing. But he's saying, not watch my lips. He's saying, look at my paper. Look at the paper, as Ray said. Look at the terms we table. Focus on the negotiations, gentlemen, and don't play games, double, triple, confusing, chaotic, or deception games between yourselves and the Europeans, between yourselves and Zelensky, and so on. Let's focus not on the ORESHNIK retaliation, not on the Lindsey Graham retaliation. Let's focus on the negotiations and don't make any mistake. Russia will not tolerate escalation dominance on your side affecting the Russian triad. They won't. But right now, the line is it's up to Trump to respond to the memorandum.
Ray, before talking about before commenting on what John just said, here is what Lindsey Graham said in Ukraine.
Said that Ukraine doesn't have good cards. Well, Russia's much bigger and has a lot more people. I get that. But the world has a lot of cards against Russia. And one of those cards that we have is about to be played in the United States Senate. In America, you have more than one person at the card table. We have 3 branches of government, and the House and the Senate are poised to act. What would change our mind if Russia came to the table, agreed to a ceasefire, and earnestly...
Yeah, he wants ceasefire. Go ahead, Ray.
Sanctions. These sanctions, if they ever were approved, are sanctions of China and sanctions of India and sanctions of third parties that deal with Russia. It would be bedlam. They're crazy. They would never work. The sanctions that have already been imposed, the Russians have dealt with them much better than anyone thought. We had Biden saying that, the ruble will be made rubble. Well, just the opposite happened. So sanctions, even if the Senate did that, I think that's really not a heavy card in the Senate deck. Now, I think bottom line here, for me at least, is that the Russians aren't in any hurry. I think John is right. The ball is sort of in the U.S. court, but the rules of the game are clear. Rubio and Lavrov are going to be talking to each other ad referendum to their presidents. Okay, this is how it's different from before. This is why the specter of nuclear war is much less than when a non compos mentis, Joe Biden, was in charge with underlings that thought they could get away with anything. Okay, so no hurry on Putin's side. The terms are clear. Who's got the upper hand? Russia has just about won. Okay, that's the upper hand. Okay, it's going to be harder to denazify all this stuff, but Ukraine has been effectively demilitarized. And we'll see that, Nick. I mean, it was Budanov, the head of military intelligence, that said about this time last year, yeah, we could probably last till about June next year, like this, like now. Okay. So let me just finish up the way I finish up this article, and that will constrain my diversion here. The driving issue is bigger than Ukraine. Both Trump and Putin want to improve U.S.-Russia relations. Other matters, including Ukraine, are secondary. As of now, at least, both sides seek a negotiated settlement in the war as their primary option, not ORESHNIKs, not escalation. Each side will do its best to avoid escalation and show a measured flexibility and even patience. That's what we're seeing now, patience, until such time as Ukraine's army disintegrates. Last sentence. It appears that this is going to happen soon. I believe that at that point, Putin will be happy to supply as much lipstick as may be needed to conceal the pig of defeat for Ukraine and the collective West. Now, do I see flexibility on Putin's part? I do. There's lots that can be made up to be lipstick. I always cite Odessa, which I don't think the Russians wanted to destroy, So there are lots of ways to get around this and give Trump and give the West some measure of standing as not having lost abysmally. But the die is cast. The Ukrainians are losing, unlike this time 2 years ago when Putin had already lost. I mean, the intelligence is not good, but at least the facts on the ground are very, very, very clear now, even to people like Kellogg. Kellogg is one of the guys on the outside. I don't know why they let it go on Fox. I dare that he had talking points from the administration at that point. So I think John is right in terms of the U.S. has got the ball now in this game, and I imagine that by and by, when Trump makes an announcement, he'll say, "Beats the hell out of me. I didn't know anything about these things." It's that damn Jake Sullivan. That Pony Blinken forgot. They blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. They like to blow up things with the British to help them, and as I say, that's a really favorite technique of the British, blowing up things.
John, for me, a good sign, a positive sign in the negotiations with Ukrainians would be the presence of Steve Witkoff. In my opinion, he's just somehow we're witnessing that he's disappearing from the scene.
Yes.
Don't hear from Witkoff. You see, what is the main reason that he's somehow not that much involved in what's going on right now?
Well, that's half of the answer is on the US side, and half the answer on the Russian side. I'll speak to the Russian side. Yes, you're right, and it's important. Thank you for mentioning it, Nima. Witkoff has disappeared as a mediator of what President Putin is trying to transmit to President Trump. Why? Well, President Putin has delivered in the memorandum exactly what he wants Trump to address. So there's no need for a messenger boy. First. Second, from a Russian point of view, Witkoff's role was to negotiate the return of normal business relations and state business relations between the United States oligarchs and the Russian oligarchs. Putin was feeding his oligarch constituency at home the chance to negotiate through Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian investment fund, with Witkoff representing the Trump family, the Trump business interests, Howard Lutnick's family and business, the whole lot, Elon Musk and so on, the opportunity to make money instead of war. And that's a very important constituency that had to be fed on both sides. That's subordinated now to the provision in the memorandum, the Russian term sheet. Sanctions come off. The issue, the priority between Dmitriev and Witkoff until now has been how to reduce sanctions. The solution I've written about, reported, the Russian perception is President Trump has very limited capacity to take sanctions off if they've been legislated by the Congress. What he can do is stop enforcement. He can issue executive orders to stop enforcement. So Witkoff's role as a messenger boy has ended. His role as an intermediary between the business interests is limited politically when you have higher level military and diplomatic negotiations. And that's why we're in Istanbul. And that's another important element that Kellogg was instructed to emphasize. Clumsily he did it, but he did it. And that is to say, you heard him, being positive about Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan, and very positive about Turkish President Erdogan. Why is that important for Kellogg to say it on instruction from the White House? Because until very recently, Vance, Trump, Rubio were all encouraging a move of the negotiations away from Turkey. They tried the Vatican, no go from the Russian side. Kellogg was saying a week or two ago, he thinks the next round will be in Geneva. That's Switzerland, not a neutral state. Neither is the Pope neutral from a Russian point of view. So what has been said by the Russians has been heard, and Kellogg is saying it. We're happy to continue with Turkey as the media. That's a change tactically on the US side. And that's an important thing to recognize that Kellogg was saying for Trump and the other the silent majority, meaning Trump, Rubio, etc., and the others. So the other thing that's come off the table that eliminates Witkoff's usefulness for the time being is a very clear statement. There's not going to be a Trump-Putin summit meeting as Trump wanted in a hurry. We talked about that the last time. There was a last flurry of activity on the part of both sides to see if Putin would come to the UAE, to Dubai, to meet with Trump when he was there. There was a flurry of effort as Trump left open his schedule as he returned home to drop in by airplane at Istanbul. Now, Yuri Ushakov, the presidential assistant for foreign policy, equivalent to national security advisor on the other side, has clearly said no summit meeting for the foreseeable future, sometime later in the year, maybe. Presidential spokesman Peskov has said more or less the same. So Trump has had to accept he won't get his grandstand soon. He's had to accept the Russian conditionality, agree negotiations first, then ceasefire and summit later in that order. These are from a Russian point of view to understand for all of us. The Russians think they're making headway, as Ray said. Headway isn't end of war. It isn't an end to the US commitment to sequencing the war up the northern front, up to Finland and across the Arctic Circle, and sequencing the war with a priority in China. Russia is under no illusion, and neither are the Chinese, that this is the second part of the double US game. Nobody's under an illusion in Russia that Trump's so-called withdrawal from the battlefield of the Ukraine means a peace deal for Europe and a mutual security arrangement as the Russian side proposed back in 2021. No. The idea, however, on the Russian side is there's a big chance with Trump to end the battlefield conflict on terms that encourage further improvement from the Baltics, from Poland, from Romania, all the way up to Finland. Just bear in mind what the Russians face, and it's nuclear. It's nuclear warheads in Romania. It's nuclear warheads in Poland. Yes, we have now a new Polish president, Mr. Nawrocki, who has a different view from the Tusk government on whether nuclear weapons can be moved in and out of Poland. But the Russian side has to understand Poland is a potential nuclear platform. Mr. What's his name? Alexander Stubb, the new president since 2024 of Finland, is inviting the possibility of Finland accepting nuclear weapons against Finland's law at the moment on US-based territories in Finland, pointing right at Russia. So please understand, from Russian point of view, none of these nuclear threats are diminishing. That's why the nuclear demonstration effect of hitting the air bases and attacking the triad is so important. It's an ORESHNIK moment because of all that will follow if the US now doesn't meet the terms on the memorandum. It's not an ultimatum, but as Oleg Tsarov points out, the former Ukrainian opposition leader now in Crimea, and a very important voice that we should all listen to, that the terms on the Russian memorandum are not an ultimatum. That's what Medinsky said in Istanbul. No, they're a capitulation and surrender of the Ukrainian regime as a platform for threatening Russia. And that's what the memorandum says. If the US doesn't accept it, it's not because the US is at war with the Europeans over this, or they don't want to unload Zelensky. It's because the US side wants to continue the war with Russia elsewhere. So we're at a multiple testing moment, multiple warheads, if you like. ORESHNIK's a multiple warhead device. And the US side has to decide, but it's right now very silent. And as Ray said, and there's no doubt about it, the way the Russian side began to negotiate after this attack was in the Lavrov telephone call with Rubio. The way that Medinsky and the Ukrainians, Umerov and Yermak, negotiated was not in the open session. Look very carefully. And Medinsky makes the point at Kremlin a few hours ago. There were more than 3 hours of negotiation between the two sides. And that's right, 2 hours was spent what the Russians politely called closed format, meaning behind closed doors, in which Medinsky, Umerov, and probably the 4 on the Russian side and the 4 on the Ukrainian side, but the key ones are Yermak and Umerov, defense minister and presidential assistant, negotiated in private with Medinsky, Kostyakov, the head of the GRU, Fomin, deputy defense minister, and Mr. Galuzin, from the Russian Foreign Ministry. That's where there was real negotiation. I entirely agree with Ray. That's a serious but entirely secret talk. And both sides came to that table knowing what the memorandum says. So from a Russian point of view, in that negotiation that's secret, which occurred after the Lavrov-Rubio call, we have the signs that lend some confidence on the Russian side that a real ORESHNIK retaliation will not be necessary because the US will find a way for Zelensky to accept and for the Europeans to back off on the promise that the big rearmament program that Chancellor Merz wants to introduce and Mr. Stubb all the way up to Finland wants to introduce, that this will continue with US support. Why? Because all that money will be spent in the United States.
Ray.
Well,
Before
I just comment a little comment on Witkoff. He did his job, as John said. You know, there were summits that were by telephone, but that's summitry. The Russians are smart enough to avoid giving Trump what he really, really wants, an in-person sort of thing, prematurely. But if memory serves, Witkoff, some of his credibility has been eroded with respect to Hamas and his promises to Hamas. Oh, wow, looks like they were double-crossed. Looks like when he decided that he would be persuaded to go up to see Putin with Kellogg's 22 points or whatever the hell they are. And Putin's, no, thanks very much. We know about them. He wasn't even allowed to go up there. But he's done his job. His boss, Trump, is talking to Lavrov's boss, Putin. Lavrov and Foreign Secretary of State Rubio are talking. Things are going to get better in terms of a decent relationship and communication. And you know, as the war drags on, and as it becomes clearer and clearer that what President Obama, you know, Biden was vice president then. I don't think he was paying very much attention. But as President Obama famously said back in 2015, Ukraine is not a core interest of the United States. It is a core interest of Russia. The worst thing, said Obama, the worst thing we could do to the Ukrainians would be to give them the idea that they could prevail against a much mightier nation on their periphery. And that's what we did. That's what Biden did. And that's what actually was done consistently now. So the Ukrainians had taken it on the chin. 11 years ago, John Mearsheimer warned about this. He said, look, the fracas in Ukraine is the fault of the West, okay? And if we continue to pursue bringing Ukraine into NATO, this will result in the utter destruction of that whole country. We're close to that now. Mearsheimer needs to be listened to. Other people need to be listened to besides General Kellogg.
John, before wrapping up, do you want to add something?
Well, a couple of things. Just Obama's role and Biden's role back in 2014 have been misunderstood. And the real test of the relationship between the two and the role that Biden played is spelled out in the story of the shooting down of MH17. On that day, I've written the book, that's why it sticks in my memory. The shoot down of that plane came at a moment when the Ukrainian military under Poroshenko were facing defeat against the Donbass militia, and they badly needed US and NATO intervention to save them. That's what Poroshenko thought. That's what he communicated to Vice President Biden. The shootdown of the MH17 was part of and in a sequence of events that had that as the Ukrainian and Biden objective. When the event happened, and I reported that at the time, the sequence was that Obama was not sure that the Russians had shot the aircraft down, killing all 298 people on board. And neither was John Kerry, the Secretary of State at the time. What then happened over approximately 6 hours of that day, July 17, 2014, was Biden agreed with Poroshenko to persuade the US administration to come in unambiguously blaming the Russian side, and that would trigger two things. One, the beginning of serious, heavy economic warfare against Russia. The economic sanctions began with the justification that the Russian state, President Putin himself, had authorized such a thing. And that's ultimately what the Dutch show trial years later ruled. Biden pushed that. Obama retreated and accepted Biden. And Kerry was told to say that we have satellite imagery which proves it. Well, there was no such satellite imagery going forward several years. But the Biden role was crucial in swinging the US behind Poroshenko and an intervention force. Now, an intervention force was proposed. It would have had Dutch, and Australian troop boots on the ground. It was to be a NATO operation, allegedly to rescue the black boxes and the bodies of the victims. Chancellor Merkel at the time, not the neo-fascist that Merz is, Merkel at the time said that will be a disaster. It'll bring the Russian army in when we're ill-prepared. And she, the German side, vetoed it. And the evidence is in the Australian records, the Dutch records, and so on. But it's in the book. And that's important to say. Why now? Because the US policy, and Mearsheimer is not the first, and he won't be the last to have discovered something that goes back long before Mearsheimer graduated. And that is US policy has been to destroy Russia as a significant power in Europe, and after 45, to challenge the US empire. And I have to say that your esteemed guest, Colonel Wilkerson, now refers to that policy, now refers to the US in your program, and I salute him for doing it, as the empire. So what happened that day, July 17, 2014, was that Obama lined up with Biden in accepting that Ukraine would be a warfighting platform for the empire. Now, as Ray said, look at where we are now. The warfighting platform is almost totally defeated and ruined. But the war of the empire continues. And as Lawrence Wilkerson said on your program a day or so ago, Nima, an attack on the strategic triad, as has just happened, is an act of war by a state against Russia's nuclear deterrence policy. And that has to be taken very seriously. So we agree, is summing up now.
I don't agree. I don't agree with Larry on that. I've debated him on that. I don't see any big significance to the fact that there were strategic bombers at these bases. So I just want to make sure that we don't agree on that.
Okay, well, this isn't a democracy. It's not Wilkerson's vote and my vote against your vote, Ray. We just respect each other, and we look to help the audience understand that we looking at the evidence, and we were not, and you get to cast the casting vote, Nima, if we were a democracy, but we're not. We're just talking heads here. But we are talking about something as crucial as war fighting from one platform that's been ruined onto ones that are still active. And that's the crucial test at this moment. That's what makes it an ORESHNIK moment versus a Lindsey Graham moment versus an Istanbul moment. We would like, and Ray and I and you all agree, we would like to see that negotiation succeed in neutralizing the battlefield and reducing the risk, strategic, conventional, strategic, operational, tactical, of clashes between the two powers. But we can't imagine that the two great powers, Russia and the United States, plus China and India, are going to stop the level of strategic competition that's underway. Russia thinks Trump's the best chance right now in a way that wasn't possible when the Biden administration was on. Well, lots of slips between cups and lips, as Ray has also said before.
Yeah. Ray, can we wrap it up, or?
Sure. Well, I'll just add a couple of 2 cents, but we've gone on for a while, but this I've learned a lot. No, I applaud John once again for his research on MH17. That was a key date, July 17, 2014. Yeah, 2014. So right after the coup. The fact that when I raised my eyebrows before, when John said that Kerry knew, or Kerry and Obama both was suspecting that, this was not the Russians. Well, I raised my eyebrows because Kerry lied through his teeth just 3 days later on July 20th, when he went before all the big news programs and says, we have trajectory information. We know when it was shot, where it was shot from, and when it hit the target, and the target fell right down. And the key thing that John emphasized, that's when the sanctions became possible. Because before then, the Europeans were resisting the sanctions for very, very good reasons. It hurts them more than it hurt Russia. What else? Well, just a kind of a very footnote on this. You can't depend on secretaries of state to tell the truth. Oh my gosh. Kerry lied to his teeth on many things. As a matter of fact, this is interesting. When Obama went to St. Petersburg for a economic summit at which he met and talked with Putin man to man, one-on-one, the morning he arrived, Putin went on Russian TV and said, that fellow Kerry, он врет, он знает, что врет. Это печально. He lies, he knows he's lying. This is really sad. Obama arrives and they do a deal which avoided U.S. opening a war on Syria, okay? Now, so the other thing I just point out is this happens all the time. Back when there was an evil empire, right? Reagan just called the Russians an evil empire. There were all kinds of bad things happen, and KAL 7 was shut down. Not 298 people, but close to it. I think 268 or something like that, including a congressperson. Well, I was there at the time, okay? I know that what the U.S. presented at the UN was not the whole story. And I'll just finish up with this. The U.S. presentation at the UN was the Russians shot that civilian aircraft down deliberately. They knew it was a civilian aircraft and they shut it down deliberately. Okay. Now, the first part was right. They shut it down deliberately. It was dark. The Soviet fighter was trying to identify the thing, couldn't. He got a command from the control center, shoot it down, and he shut it down. There had been an intelligence plane in that RC-123 or 135, whatever it was, in that area at the time. So they thought it was an intelligence. It was hundreds of miles inside Siberia. Okay, what am I saying here? Well, presentation at the UN was, I'm not proud of it. We learned later by the fellow in the State Department who had the tape recordings. He complained in this book he wrote that most of those intercepted messages that proved that the Russians didn't know it was a civilian aircraft were just excised, and they only played the part that you, oh yeah, shoot down, okay? Now, this is interesting because his conclusion was, look, it's a high-level State Department official. Look, all countries lie, including our own. Whoever lies first wins. Period. Well, Kerry won. I mean, even the Dutch succumbed to Kerry's machinations, as John knows better than I. But so one has to be really careful. I think there is a premium on old people like John and me to tell the truth at the time so that people can know that, well, you know, this ain't exactly as it appears. And thanks, Nima, for giving us the time and the air and the space to say what we think we know and what we hope is true.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ray and John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Nima.
Thanks, Nima. John.